He's on the call 2-3 times a day, actually, along with Hillary Shelton, with Representative Sheila Jackson-Lee and Representative Al Green on that question to make sure resources are directed to the affected area and those resources are directed to communities who are most in need. You know, people can't evacuate because of resources. You know, going through Katrina, it's a small church on a peninsula called East Biloxi. And Reverend Haynes, who since died, they had gone through so many hurricanes that he would open the church up and they had a second floor. And the senior citizens in that community knew to go to Main Street Baptist Church. Let me clear that up. Main Street Missionary Baptist Church. He used to correct me all the time. Be clear, right? And because they will go up and they will go to the church, and if the water began to come in, they will go upstairs and they would pray the night away, or they would pray the storm away, as they say. That's the reality for so many people, because in that community, Main Street Missionary Baptist Church was their refuge. And here were individuals who worked every day and retired. And because they were low-wage earners, they did not have the means to evacuate. And some of them were so stubborn they weren't going to evacuate anyway. But they had a place to go. Main Street Missionary Baptist Church is also the hub for our Biloxi branch of the NAACP. And so we exist where the need exists and where our people exist. And our role is to ensure that individuals who will go to a church or seek us out, that we do all we can to get the resources to support their quality of life.
Okay, we're going to get it. There's a bunch of questions that have been sent in.
Only the easy ones. I don't want no hard questions.
I'm just going to ask you the fair ones, okay, which are all of them. You talked about a number of issues, one of them being about the Confederate memorials, and there's a number of questions that hit on that issue. Do you think that it should be just taken down altogether, moved to a museum? You have specific ones, you know, in Atlanta, you're talking about whether or not they're going to erect an MLK memorial on top of Stone Mountain. You're talking about any number of configurations of this. What is the approach that the NAACP supports? Is it a locality by locality thing or an across the board thing? What's your view on that?
Part one, symbol that recognize treason should not represent a governmental entity, period. If there are those who want to recognize and celebrate that, it's okay to relocate them in a museum or a cemetery. I prefer cemetery. Part two, even if it exists, then we believe people have the right to have monuments, but it should not be financed by public dollars on public display. It should not. And thirdly, and this is closer to me, there should be no state that still have a Confederate symbol in the flag, like Mississippi. You know, the symbol that we identify as the Confederate flag wasn't even a Confederate flag. It was the battle flag of General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. When he died, he stated that the relics of the Confederacy should be buried. He did not want any of those symbols when he died. The Confederate flag, as we now identify it as, was resurrected in the 1930s during the Second Reign of Terror, when whites, particularly in the South, but across the country, after watching the Birth of a Nation in 1914, began to use it as a symbol of terrorism. We quickly identified the burning cross in someone's yard as a sign of terrorism, but next to the cross was always that Confederate symbol. It should not exist. It should not be tolerated. And if there are any entities that have a display of 50 flags, remove Mississippi's flag if you want to move forward as a nation.
Well, that gets to the question. I can put that one down, yes, because that's Benny Thompson.
That's right.
You hear this. We've had your predecessors here for many years. And you hear this question a lot. How do you respond to the criticism that the NAACP has outlived its usefulness?
Just watch the news. You know, that comes up. And
whether or not the NAACP has outlived its usefulness. It comes up for all of its predecessors. I've been here long enough to see it.
That is a question that bubbled up. When I took the position as state president of NAACP, my counterparts also said the same thing. But if you move across this landscape, and many communities, the NAACP is the only vehicle individuals have to raise their voice and ensure that democracy exists in their local community. We are too quick to follow trends, bells, and whistles. NAACP has never been a large city operation. It is in communities where no one know of. It is the vehicle for individuals who live in those communities who are so oppressed or trying to prevent schemes of oppression. It is a representative organization, small d democracy, that any number of individuals come together and they make that local unit work. So for someone to question whether or not a collection of individuals who live in rural communities or any community should not come and utilize the vehicle of the NAACP, I often ask, do you understand who we are, what we do, or are you relevant, or the question that you're asking me relevant?
Speaking of relevant questions, you talked about public policy and the White House. You brought that up a number of times. The Congressional Black Caucus has gone back and forth about how and under what circumstances it will meet with the president. What's the NAACP's take on how it will be engaged with the Trump administration or not? And if so, why? If not, why not?
Well, with any president, our position in terms of meeting is based on substance, not ceremony. And as I understand, the members of the Congressional Black Caucus, as they deliberate the question of meeting, their question is, are we meeting with the president based on substance and not ceremony? No president should utilize an institution like the NAACP as a photo op. If we're talking about substantive outcomes, then we welcome that meeting. If we're talking about a photo op, then that's a meeting that we will not have.
What's an example of a substantive outcome?
You want 1, 5, or 10?
1 or 2. Maybe 2.
A substantive outcome is abolishing the Kobach-Pence Commission. A substantive outcome is not removing or not seeking to remove the consent orders in municipalities where police officers have been bad actors. A substantive outcome is not reversing the previous administration rule that they would not give military equipment to local law enforcement. I mean, all of those, I mean, I can keep going.
Well, in fact, you just talked about yesterday's decision. You released a statement on it. What's the NAACP prepared to do now that the executive order has been issued to give military-style equipment back to police departments, which happened in the wake of Ferguson?
Well, you know, in many ways, we're like the press. We can sound the alarm, we can make the noise, and we can educate the community, but we have 3 branches of government. We have 3 branches of government. So our next step to really change the dynamic is in 2018. To ensure that we increase turnout so that people who come from communities situated, like the ones we represent, can have a true voice on what the makeup of the second branch of government, which is Congress, so that they can be better positioned to hold the president accountable. But with executive orders, it is just that, it's executive orders. And unfortunately, elections have consequences. So we have to deal with some of these executive orders until 2020.
Since you said elections have consequences, and you talked about voting, you talked about compulsory voting, which is not happening in this country anytime soon. So how are you?
Maybe not now, you know.
Well, you know, how do you see encouraging people to get voting levels up to even more unprecedented levels that there were in, for example, 2008 and other election cycles, where they may make a difference towards a 2018 or 2020 or other election cycles?
That's the challenge that we're facing as an association. That's why we're going through this interim period. How can we, as a national office, be more responsive and supportive of our local units and their ability to increase the level of participation? That we entered this space understanding that if we continue to do what we've always done, we're going to get what we always got. And so my challenge and the staff challenge, and I didn't recognize that our Chief Operating Officer here, Claudia Withers, and Marvin Owens, who is Director of our Economic Development Department, our challenge is how do we work to ensure that we as national staff more responsive to our local units so they can be stronger in getting the vote out when we need to. In many communities, African Americans vote at a higher percentage during presidential elections. The problem we're facing, we're not voting in local and state elections when we need the vote to turn out. And so the challenge for the NAACP over the next year, or next several years, is to elevate the conversation so people can understand it's just not the presidential election cycle we need to turn out, it's every election cycle.
Let's stick with voting rights. What's your reaction to Supreme Court Justice, Associate Justice Alito's stay that's put on the latest voting rights decision in Texas?
Repeat the question one more time.
What's your reaction to the stay Supreme Court Justice Alito put on the latest voting rights decision in Texas?
So, you know, when you look at how...
Explain that to folks that don't know what the decision was.
I'm going to let Hillary explain because he's brilliant. He's brilliant.
Come on up, Hillary.
So I'm limping a bit. I made the mistake of playing basketball with my 13-year-old.
Did you win?
No, clearly not. Clearly not. So our concern over the Shelby decision is very clear. Quite frankly, anytime you have something that actually dismantles the protections that were put in place for our Voting Rights Act, they're very much needed. And one of the most important provisions, of course, is Section 4B. When we talk about this decision, we're really talking about a roundabout, almost rope-to-dope approach to weakening voter protection in the United States. So it's no surprise. The same organization that worked so hard to put the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in place in the first place is strongly opposed to anything that will weaken it. As a matter of fact, even at the time of the Shelby decision, the NAACP had already been working on a number of provisions, even with the Voting Rights Act very clearly in place, to strengthen the opportunity for every eligible American to cast an unfettered vote and make sure, indeed, that vote is counted. So the only thing I want to add to that, kind of on the sideline, the questions were asked about what we want to see happen in any conversation with the President of the United States. We believe in paper and apologize to the environmentalists in the room. I've got copies of our full legislative agenda and everything we would ask the President to help support moving forward to make sure our country lives up to its constitutional promises of equal protection and equal opportunity under law. I've got those for you when the meeting is over, by the way.
Thank you. Anything else you want to add on that, or we'll move on to the next question?
Okay. Isn't he smooth?
No more basketball with your 13. Let's see here. Oh, this is interesting. We just had a big title fight this weekend with Conor McGregor and Floyd Mayweather. Floyd Mayweather has a repeated reputation for domestic abuse charges. What role, if any, does the NAACP have to play in combating domestic violence, given that African-American women experience disproportionately higher rates of death and injury from domestic abuse? If no such initiatives exist, why not?
We are a policy-focused organization. We care about all of the citizens in our community. And if we play any role in that, is to ensure that women, along with children, along with any aggrieved party, have equal protection under the law, but the law is sufficient to provide the protection. And what we've seen over the years is an imbalance in terms of how the law is applied to protect women who have been abused. Some of that falls into our scope, some of it don't fall into our scope. And we recognize we cannot be everything to everybody, but we support those who advocate to ensure that women, along with children, along with anyone else who are being abused, that the law is applied equally, and that is a good law to provide the necessary protections.
I think Hillary wants to invest.
I apologize again. Let me limp over to the microphone.
Would you just stand? Don't move after this.
Why are you going to stand your mind?
No, very good. Derek is absolutely right, but let me also say this for the record. The NAACP was one of the organizations that actually introduced the Violence Against Women Act, working with now former Vice President Joe Biden. We work for every improvement along those lines, making it a permanent agency within the Department of Justice. Very proud of that. Also, we've worked to make sure, as Derek said earlier, the real value of a nation is not just what it says, but what it's willing to actually put its resources toward. We've always worked very hard to make sure the Violence Against Women department within the Department of Justice is fully funded, and will continue to work in that direction. It's extremely important to us in our communities and throughout the country.
Thank you, Hillary.
Don't sit down.
Oh.
We'll stick with sports. The NAACP has joined the fraternity of Colin Kaepernick in writing the NFL commissioner and demanding his reinstatement, and wanting some explanation as to why he hasn't been signed. Have you gotten a response from Commissioner Goodell?
We have not.
And what are your next steps for pressing for him for an answer?
The reason why we decided to enter into that conversation is based on the principle of those who have a platform, entertainers and athletes, have always been a key vehicle for us to raise issues. The issues that Colin Kaepernick was raising are legitimate issues. And we would hate to see the NFL or any industry suppress the voice of individuals who are willing to use that platform to advocate for social justice. We are mourning the death of Dick Gregory. He was on the vanguard of using his platform to advance social justice. I oftentimes work with Danny Glover, who uses his platform to advance social justice. And so for the NAACP or any group to stand idly by, where the appearance, we don't know the facts, that's why we're asking for a meeting, where the appearance seem to be that the NFL is seeking to suppress his voice, then we have an obligation to support those who are willing to speak up on issues of social justice. Our next step is we've asked for a meeting with the commissioner. If we're not granted the meeting, we're going to be working with the NFL Players Association to make sure we work with them and through them, because if they can do it to one player, they can do it to all the players.
Just to remind those who in the viewing audience and public radio audience who are joining late, if you do hear applause in the room, it is not from the working press. There are members of the public that are invited to our luncheons. Why?
The press don't like what I'm saying? Oh, no. I get it.
We like enough to invite you. Charlottesville. And we'll combine this into one question. You've issued a travel advisory to Missouri. We've had what happened in Charlottesville. Will you issue a similar travel advisory to Charlottesville that you've done to Missouri? And I'll add to that, why do you think white nationalists feel so emboldened to come out of the shadows with tiki torches and everything else? Is there an upside to now that it's in our faces as opposed to under the rug?
Well, we can say emphatically that the governor of Virginia and the officials of Virginia, they responded timely and appropriately to the event. They showed the level of concern and empathy that any policymaker should have when you have domestic terrorists enter into your territory. Because many of the individuals who were in Charlottesville were not from Virginia. They traveled from far and wide, from David Duke all the way to the person who drove from Ohio to murder the individual in the crowd. We see these individuals as domestic terrorists. We should not miss our words. They go to incite harm and contact. And for us to say that they're part of neo-Nazi only, or they're KKK only, or they're white supremacists only, is not to fully appreciate what they're seeking to do and who they are. I am not so young that I don't remember Timothy McVeigh. Timothy McVeigh is cut from the same cloth as the individuals here. And prior to 9/11, that was the biggest incident of terrorism on our soil committed by a citizen of this country. We need to address domestic terrorists for who they are and not try to excuse away what they do. And unfortunately, this administration has created a climate where he tried to have false equals where none exist, where he give room for individuals so situated as domestic terrorists to feel comfortable to walk in public without the hoods anymore. That the candle ceremony is a Nazi ceremony, and the tiki torch was to represent the candle ceremony, and that this is not simply an attack on African Americans, it's an attack on Americans. And that we must stand up and be clear with our voice. We support strengthening the Hate Crime Act because data matter. Policy should be driven by data, not politics. And so when we were able to get the Hate Crime Act passed in 2009, a real important component was left out: the requirement of local jurisdictions providing data. And if we are able to get a data-driven look at hate crime, we will be able to identify almost everybody in that crowd because local law enforcement know who they are. And we need to identify them for who they are, domestic terrorists.
On the domestic terrorist question, this actually goes to public education. Whether or not the NAACP is working with school systems, states and school systems, to try and not, in this questioner's, not my words, glorify domestic terrorists and people who purposely commit treason, glorified in curriculums.
One of the things that we're going to be seeking to do in the near future is call a meeting with textbook publishers to talk about the content in the textbooks. Because what has happened for far too long, we seek to water down what took place around the Civil War. It was an act of treason. Make no bones about it. And to whitewash what took place is only to suppress the tensions that's always bubbling below the surface in this country. You know, the question of the 21st century is the race question. That's what W.E.B. Du Bois said in The Souls of Black Folks. He wrote that in the 1920s. And we're still dealing with the question of race. We're dealing with the question of race because we won't let go of past that's based on revisionist history. See, revisionist history won't allow us to truly look at a future because we're always going to be stuck in that past. And the tools of race allow people to use others under a false narrative to control their vote. In the South, if you take a public policy issue and you wrap it around race, you get people to vote against their interest. If you take a public policy issue and you wrap it around morality or religion, you get people to vote against their interests. We need to weaken the tool of race and racism so that we can have public policy that improve the quality of life of everybody and that individuals are not being used and misinformed and miseducated. And I'm talking about white individuals now, working class whites, to think that they're part of some false narrative of white supremacy when in fact they are being exploited for cheap labor like many other people.
Another public policy questions. You say that the NAACP is for public policy that helps African Americans and other marginalized communities. But the NAACP and other mainline, quote unquote, mainline civil rights groups have been criticized in the African American press and elsewhere for taking large funds from telco giants like AT&T and Comcast, and then backing policies like approving mega media mergers and attempts to kill net neutrality favored by those corporations. How do you respond to those criticisms? And they're referring to a piece earlier this year in The Intercept titled "Civil Rights Groups Funded by Telecoms Back Donald Trump's Plan to Kill Net Neutrality."
I wish the writer of that question was at meetings with me over the last 2 weeks with two of the telecom giants who are really frustrated or upset or not at ease. Is that a better word? Not at ease.
Good words.
Good words, right? Because of an op-ed I just authored that was published in The Hill. That we're very clear that free, unfeathered access to the internet should not be based on a corporate interest. That the internet now is the public free library, and it should continue to be public and free. So that's our position. And the telecom industry are not happy about a clear position because we're very, point. They said, well, we agree with you on that point. Well, I'm glad you agree with us. Now, the regulatory scheme to enforce that must be in place. You may not like the vehicle that currently exists, but we're agnostic to the vehicle. We need to ensure a free, unfeathered access to the internet. And so NACP is always saying, well, we're in the corporate pockets or we're not timely on our issues, but if you scratch the surface, we do what we can to ensure a democracy that works. And if you have interruptions in the acquisition of knowledge, democracy cannot work.
Andrew Young, the former mayor of Atlanta, among other accomplishments, pointed out over the weekend that there was 65% approval rating for the civil rights legislation passed in the 1960s. He says the approval rating for Black Lives Matter and other groups is much lower in the teens, and groups like the white supremacists, the Ku Klux Klan, and others feel much more comfortable in speaking out and marching to make their views known. What should civil rights groups and just average Americans do to deflect the hate speech, not only against African Americans, but against immigrants, Jews, Muslims, and other religious minorities? How do people of color get our, quote unquote, our America back again?
This is where public policy matters. In 1915, when Woodrow Wilson aired The Birth of a Nation in the White House, it sent a signal to terrorists that they should increase their ranks. And we've seen an explosion in the membership of the Christian Knights of the Ku Klux Klan and other similarly situated organizations. That signal created a void that we had to fight against from that period, and before that period, all the way up through the 70s. With the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and many other acts. But it was public policy that made it uncomfortable for racial hate groups to exist, and we've seen their membership numbers dwindle. We've seen individuals benefit off of policies we were pushing, i.e. affirmative action. More white women benefit from affirmative action than African Americans. That I cannot point to a single civil rights piece of legislation that we've advocated for that it only affected African Americans. No, it makes democracy work. It makes the quality of life for everybody better. That if it's us today, it will be you tomorrow. You meaning Jewish community, you meaning Irish community, you meaning the Italians, you meaning those with red hair and one earring in the left ear. Because people seek to divide, and if they are successful in dividing, they can divert from the real questions. And the real question in this country right now is economic security. And when people feel insecure, they look for what tribe they're going to be a part of, and sometimes that tribe are tribes that are misinformed about what history really tells them, and over this question of white supremacy. It is our role to unveil truth. It is our role to push for public policy that provides protection. It is also our role to build coalitions across